The confirmed return of the Pac-12, including Husky football, the Seahawks line up against America's team in Week 3, and the Mariners are officially eliminated from playoff contention in 2020. Let's take it around the sound. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Around the Sound. I have episode 5 for you right now today. We got a little bit of news to cover. We got some previews before the weekend. Seahawks Week 3 playing Cowboys on Sunday, so we got plenty of stuff to talk about. Next week, we should also have plenty of stuff to talk about. We'll be able to wrap up those games that are going on this weekend, as well as another Q&A opportunity at some point next week. So keep in touch with the social media on Instagram at Around the Sound Seattle if you'd like to participate in next week's Q&A, as well as another On This Date in Seattle Sports. We had the debut of that segment last episode on this Wednesday. You can go back and listen or watch that if you haven't already. You guys seem to like the Fail Mary, so we'll be doing another one of those next week. Make sure you also follow me on Twitter at @ThePeytonThomas. Keep up with everything that I'm involved in. And, of course, subscribe to the YouTube channel at PTHOM Media. That's at PTOM Media. Every episode of Around the Sound is posted there if you prefer to watch it, or you can listen to Around the Sound wherever you get your podcast. Let's hop right into the news this week. We got the Pac-12 returning. They were one of the last two conferences that were holding out. The Big Ten was holding out with the Pac-12 as college football around the rest of the country started up. The Big 12 announced earlier this week that they would be having football starting in late October. They would be playing an 8-game schedule, which left the Pac-12 as the last Big 5 conference yet to make a decision on college football this fall. Well, I suppose both the Pac-12 and the Big Ten had made decisions this fall whether they were going to play fall football. Both of them had announced that they weren't. They both went back after the Big Ten. The Big Ten was lobbying for it. A few schools there were lobbying for football to return this fall. The Big Ten ultimately decided to play football this fall starting in the last week of October. Now, a week later, the Pac-12 started talks. They voted on it. They voted to have football. So the Pac-12 will begin in November. November 6th is going to be the first day for the Pac-12, and they'll be playing a 7-game schedule. Lots of politics seem to be involved this fall, whether you were going to play or whether you're not going to play, regardless of what conference you were in. The ACC, the SEC both started playing already, and the Big 12 as well, as along with a bunch of minor conferences. But I feel like between the Big 10 and the Pac-12, inside those two conferences, the two conferences that decided they weren't initially going to play football, both turning on that judgment now in the last week. But it seemed like a lot of politics were involved in both of those decisions between both of those conferences. And it's not an easy call to make. You have so many people saying that we shouldn't be playing football, we shouldn't be playing, and putting these athletes in danger. We have other people skeptical of the impact that COVID-19 is going to have on these athletes. Obviously, these athletes are college-age kids. They're all in great shape. And a lot of people, including myself, I would put myself in that camp, are skeptical about how much damage COVID-19 could actually do to these kids long-term. We also don't know a lot of the long-term effects, but I know that I want to play football, so this was great news to see for me, knowing that we will have we will be able to see the Pac-12 this fall. There were some minor talks, not just in the Pac-12, but within all of the Big 5 conferences and in the NCAA, whether they could have pulled off a winter season or potentially a spring season. Winter season would have been difficult if you're starting in late November and pushing through February or March. You would have had to deal with a lot of really cold weather, not particularly in the Pac-12. I think Seattle or Pullman would have been one of the worst two sites. But outside of the Pac-12, I know if you go into the Big Ten and you have a bunch of the schools like Michigan or Minnesota, you're going to deal with some pretty cold weather there. They already deal with some cold weather up there later in the season, but to have an entire winter season in that cold weather would be pretty brutal, along with the obvious fact of the reason a spring season wouldn't work is it's just not enough time for these athletes to recover. The talks of a spring season were never really going to pan out. I feel like if you know enough about football and the wear and tear that playing each week puts on your body, it would be very, very difficult for these athletes to play a complete spring season and turn around and try to play in the fall. Another side effect of trying to play that spring season is every senior who has a chance at being drafted into the NFL would forego the season and opt out immediately. They would just be prepared for the NFL draft. You only need 3 seasons in college to be eligible for the NFL draft, so all of those guys who were already eligible and were set to graduate would just forego the season. There's absolutely no reason for them to play it. If they're trying to turn around and be ready to play in the NFL in the fall, that would be absolutely brutal on the athletes to try to get ready after a spring season, be worn down. A lot of them would be injured, I would assume, and you take so much wear and tear during a college football or football season in general to be drafted right after that in the summer, and then try to turn around and get ready for training camp beginning in the late summer or early fall. That would just be brutal on all those athletes. So if we did have a spring season, you can expect all of those seniors to just forego the season and be ready for the NFL draft. So I'm really excited to have fall football because I think that we'll see a lot of those seniors who were potentially getting ready to go into the draft before we had a confirmed return of the Pac-12. We saw a lot of those seniors be ready for the NFL draft, saying that they're probably going to forego the season and they're just going to get ready for that moment. Now that we do have the confirmed return of fall football, I wouldn't be surprised if you see a lot of those players, a lot of those seniors who are potential draft picks into the NFL this next year, a lot of those guys saying, hey, okay, I'll play my senior season. We'll play this 7-game season. I'd like to stay fresh. Taking a full year off of football, a lot of these players ended their seasons in late December or early January in their bowl games of 2019, late December 2019. To take all of 2020 and most of 2021 off until you're in training camp in 2021, let's say you're drafted in 2021 and you're trying to play in the NFL in 2021, if you haven't played for a full year and a half, that would also be tough because you're trying to find a middle ground between playing a spring season then turning around and playing a fall season. That's not going to happen. You can't turn around in a month and a half or 2 months and be ready for an NFL season. But on the other side of that coin, the flip side, there's also something that if you're not playing enough, you have too long of a break between seasons. If you get off playing your junior season in a bowl game in December 2019, you're going to have all of 2020 off if you're opting out of the 2020 season, and then you're not going to be able to play again until training camp of 2021, which will be in August, assuming you're even drafted into the NFL. That seems like a really long layoff for those guys, and a lot of them, especially if you're going out from your junior year, it's out on a limb if you're even going to get drafted. Some first rounder, second rounder, third rounders are for sure going to get drafted, but for a lot of those guys who are on the brink later rounds, I would not be surprised to see those guys return for their senior seasons, be able to play a few games in the fall, play one last year with their college, and then be ready for the NFL draft come June. Head coach Jimmy Lake has gone on radio and said a few times that his players are in shape, ready for the season. However, it's going to be a tough turnaround to get these guys ready in 6 weeks. The players have been away from team facilities. They were practicing up before the Pac-12 had made a concrete decision whether we were going to have football this fall. Once the Pac-12 determined that earlier last month or 2 months ago, when the Pac-12 returned with the decision that they weren't going to play fall football, a lot of those players were sent away from team facilities. It's been 3 weeks since then on their break. They now will have to quarantine for 7 days before practicing again with the team after the Pac-12's decision was made. So those players will turn around now. They'll go into that quarantine probably today since that announcement has been made. They'll do the quarantine, and then they'll be in training camp with their team until that November 6th date, which is the first day of Pac-12 games returning. We'll keep up on more news about the heavily contested UW quarterback battle for this season. I know there's 4 guys, really, that are all competing for that job. Jimmy Lake has a lot of camp to watch before he makes a decision on which one of those guys will be leading the Washington Huskies into the 2020 season, that 7-game shortened season for the Huskies. We'll also have updates and more news on the full squad as we inch closer to that November 6th kickoff date. So stay tuned to Around the Sound because we'll be talking much more Husky football as we get closer to that day. Let's shift into the NFL now. We'll go pro. Week 3. This should be yet another exciting offensively driven game. We saw in week 1 against the Falcons between the Seahawks and Falcons a shootout. I mean, it was the offenses that dazzled and dominated that game. week 2 between the Seahawks and Patriots, we saw a 35-30 game where Russell had 5 passing touchdowns. Cam Newton did not do too bad for himself at all, keeping his team in it until the very last play on the goal line, on the 1-yard line with 3 seconds left before LJ Collier made a crucial stop of Cam Newton on the goal line to win that game. This is going to be another game along the same tone. You have 2 defenses that are pretty banged up. We'll go over the Cowboys' defensive injuries in a little bit when we talk about Russ. And the Seahawks have plenty of defensive injuries. We saw Bruce Irvin and Marquise Blair go down for the year that past game. So both offenses, both the Seahawks offense and the Cowboys offense, have plenty of weapons, and I would expect yet another shootout, a game driven by offenses going down the field and scoring touchdowns. However, I do think this is the easiest matchup of the year so far for the Seahawks. I mean, the question that I've really been asking myself since the year started is, are the Cowboys real? There's been many criticisms made about Dak Prescott, about his deep ball game. Zeke's been pretty consistent, but we haven't really seen them play anybody significant yet. I'm not sure what to make of the Rams this year. I don't think the Eagles, who they played in week 2, the Rams did beat the Eagles in week 2. They're 2-0. They beat the Cowboys in week 1 and then the Eagles in week 2. I'm still not sure how to gauge those games because I really don't think anybody in the NFC East is particularly that good. So I'll be curious to see how the Rams perform when they start playing some better teams, some teams in other divisions around the NFL. The Cowboys, week 2, they were down early. It was 20-0 or something crazy. The Falcons got up. They choked away a massive lead yet again. The Atlanta Falcons, the perennial chokers, a crazy onside kick. If you didn't catch the Falcons-Cowboys onside kick, it was absolutely crazy. The Cowboys were down late in that game. They scored a touchdown to bring it within 2 or a point. I know they were down at least 1 or 2 points, 40 seconds to go or so. They have to kick an onside kick, and they have to get it. If the Falcons recover the onside kick, they'll just take a knee, win the game. The Cowboys, Greg Zuerlein lines the football up horizontally for the onside kick. He almost passes it as if you were going to pass the ball in soccer. He kicks it with the inside of his foot and just he almost putts it. It was almost watching a putter in golf. Just softly putt the ball, and you saw the football spin, and it was just moving slowly to that 10-yard mark because on an onside kick, the ball must travel 10 yards before somebody can pick it up. The ball is just slowly spinning, slowly traveling. It didn't really look off of Greg Zuerlein's foot like the ball was going to reach the 10-yard marker for the Cowboys to be able to pick it up. But there were 3 Falcons players who went up, were watching the ball. Now, the Falcons do not have to wait for the ball to travel 10 yards. They could have easily picked up that ball and closed up the game, but they were scared that if they went for the ball, a Cowboys player would also then go for the ball because if the Falcons do touch the ball, it's a live ball for anybody to pick up. So I think the Falcons players, the 3 Falcons players who were watching the ball, all took the gamble that ball wasn't going to travel 10 yards. I'll say initially off the kick, it did not look like the ball was going to travel 10 yards. The ball just kept spinning. It kept rolling towards that 45-yard marker. It eventually made it there, and a Cowboys player jumped right on the ball. Cowboys get the ball back. They run down the field. Greg Zuerlein kicks the game-winning field goal, and the Cowboys win that game 40-39, I believe, over the Falcons in week 2. An absolute choke job by the Atlanta Falcons, the famous team who was up 28-3 in the Super Bowl, keeps choking leads away under Matt Ryan, under Dan Quinn. Dan Quinn's job is certainly on the hot seat now. It was on the hot seat when they started 1-7 last year. They finished 6-2, and he somehow managed to keep his job. This year, starting 0-2, the Seahawks loss isn't going to be too bad, but this loss is really, really going to take it for the amazing positions that they were in, that they got themselves in the first quarter and third quarter. They had big leads in both of those quarters with the ball. To choke that game away will certainly not do tons of credit points to the Atlanta front office when they're considering whether Dan Quinn should keep his job or not. Back to the Cowboys, though, with those 2 games being said, the game they lost against the Rams in week 1 and the game week 2 against the Falcons, they really haven't had a true test yet as how they're going to match up against some of the best teams in the NFC. This week will be a huge test for the Cowboys if they're able to give the Seahawks a run, if they're able to somehow stop Russell Wilson and his effective passing through the air. The Seahawks have not yet been stopped by either the Falcons in week 1 or the Patriots in week 2 through the air. Russ has had a MVP start to the season, an MVP-like start to the season. So the big question will be, can the Cowboys get it together in the secondary and stop Russ? The Cowboys' offensive line, and this was the strongest part of the Cowboys team for the last few years. This was the O-line, remember, a few years ago that made DeMarco Murray look like the best running back in the league. They had Tyron Smith. They had plenty of weapons, guys who were just massive bodies, great blockers in both the run game and the pass game, gave Dak tons of protection. Well, some of those guys are gone. Tyron Smith, the biggest all-pro piece on that line, he's still injured. He's not going to be available for the Week 3 match against the Seahawks. This offensive line is starting to struggle, and that'll really impact how much time Dak has in the pocket, obviously, and it will hurt in the running game if Zeke doesn't have as big a holes to get through. We'll have to see how that defensive line of the Seahawks, the pass rush and the run-stopping ability, some of the biggest questions for the Seahawks defense, we'll have to see how they perform against the Cowboys offensive line that isn't really what it used to be. Speaking of the injuries to the Cowboys offensive line, I do want to shift into speaking about the injuries in Week 2 across the NFL. There was so many injuries to not just role players in the NFL, but there were so many stars that went down in the NFL, and almost half of them were 49ers. The 49ers have to be running away on top of the injury standings. They have an incredible amount of players on IR for only having played 2 games. George Kittle's still injured, and they have 5 different receivers on IR. They had to pick up Mohamed Sanu midweek before Week 2. Jimmy Garoppolo went down in this game. He's going to be out for at least a week or 2. So they're starting Nick Mullins at quarterback. They have a bunch of backup receivers out there. They have no Kittle. They have Tevin Coleman and Raheem Mostert. 2 of their 3 running backs in the running game are out. They also have Nick Bosa and Solomon Thomas out for the year on the defensive line. Is it Nick Bosa or Joey Bosa? I can never remember. I always get them switched up. The great defensive ends, both out of Ohio State. One's for the Chargers and one's for the Niners, but I always get them mixed up. Anyway, whichever Bosa's on the 49ers and Solomon Thomas are out for the year on the defensive line, and those are the best 2 defensive linemen that the 49ers have. The 49ers had one of the best defensive lines coming into the year. With both of those guys out, it's going to be really, really difficult. We'll have to see how the pass rush for the 49ers is able to adapt with both of those guys out. They also have a few other injuries scattered in random places in the secondary or on the offensive line. So with Jimmy Garoppolo out, Nick Mullins is going to line up for the Niners this week against the Giants. It should be very, very interesting to see how he performs, especially missing so many receivers, Kittle, and 2 running backs. After the 49ers Jets injuries, I know at MetLife Stadium, that game was played on the road for the 49ers, Jets home game at MetLife Stadium. Many fans and analysts were questioning the turf at MetLife Stadium, whether it was up to code because so many players got injured. Turf these days, many people said, there shouldn't be so many players that their legs or their feet or their grip on the turf gives out. So they had actual professionals go look at the turf at MetLife Stadium. They deemed that the turf was okay. It passed all the inspections, but the 49ers have to play there yet again this week. They have to play back at MetLife Stadium 2 weeks in a row. The 49ers have to play the Giants this week. Obviously, MetLife Stadium in New Jersey is home to both the Jets and the Giants. The 49ers have to play there back-to-back in back-to-back weeks after Week 2, where there was a bunch of questions raised about how the MetLife turf was holding up after so many Niners players went down in that game. I can't imagine being a 49er fan right now. I would be shaking my head realizing that we have to play at MetLife Stadium yet again this week. After last week against the Jets, they had so many major players go down. I feel like if from the perspective of a 49ers fan, you would just want to get through this game regardless of result without everybody on the active roster ending up on IR. Week 2 also saw a crazy amount of the league's stars go down for a long period of time. We saw Saquon Barkley go out for the year with an ACL injury. Christian McCaffrey is going to be out for a few weeks. He had something with his ankle in the Panthers-Bucks game. I think that's who the Panthers played. So crazy amount of injuries in the NFL. You hate to see that. Football's a sport where you're always going to have to deal with a high amount of injuries, but to see that many players go down in a specific week, I know many people were wondering just what created so many injuries to happen in 1 week in the NFL. I really think it boils down to having no preseason. You do have training camp. You can run game-style drills in training camp, but playing the preseason really gets especially those younger guys, those backups, used to game time, used to getting their bodies back used to playing downs at full speed against an opponent. And without the preseason, you can still try to reimagine that and emulate it in practice, but there's nothing that can really do it justice and really recreate a game time situation quite like the preseason did. The preseason got all those guys ready for the season. Week 1, I'm sure it was a shock factor for a lot of those players getting back playing football on a real stage. But I mean, week 2 is when you really start to enter the grind and you're back on that regular schedule of recovering from your game on Sunday and working in practice all week to get ready for the next game on Sunday. And I wonder if no preseason really has an impact on how many of those players, on their match sharpness, how ready they are for the games mentally and physically. And I wonder if that results in more injuries. Let's head back to Seahawks Cowboys. I want to talk about Russell this week a little bit heading into week 3. He made more statements this week about how he was asked how he feels since he's not received a single MVP vote in his career, and he responded along the lines of, "I don't care about getting an MVP vote, I want to win the award." And it just made me think how much of a different version of Russell Wilson this is as he gets older. In the last 8 years of his career, we've seen the most humble, appreciative guy without an ounce of arrogance about him, just crediting everyone around him for the performance that his team and he puts out on the field. And I don't want to say that Russ is acting in arrogant fashion, and if he's saying anything that like he deserves the MVP award, he's certainly backing it up right now with his play on the field. I feel like he's still giving plenty of credit to the guys that are working around him. He does have plenty of weapons that are helping him out, like DK Metcalf, like David Moore. We saw incredible catches from those guys in week 2 against the Patriots. But we're certainly seeing a different version of Russ as he gets older. He's certainly putting a little bit of respect on his own name. You can tell in his press conferences, the way he talks to the media, the way he responds to types of questions like this, that he finally wants to get the recognition that he feels like he deserves. We've talked about it a lot of people in the media have talked about how Russell Wilson is really underappreciated in these last few years, really underrated. Bill Belichick came out and said that there's not really a better player in the NFL, and Russell Wilson's underappreciated, underrated. And I think with all this attention in the media, everybody calling out Russell Wilson for being so underrated, I think he's finally realizing that he deserves these awards, and he finally feels confident enough to go to the media and say, hey, I want to win the MVP. My play on the field backs this up. And certainly through the first 2 games with his crazy numbers that he's put up, he deserves, I mean, if you had to award and crown an MVP through 2 weeks of the NFL season, I think it would have to be Russell Wilson. I think barring any injury, he's going to be in that conversation throughout the course of the year. I would expect him to slow down a little bit because in these first 2 weeks, the amount of passing touchdowns and the amount of passing yards he's been able to acquire have been crazy. So I would expect him to slow down a little bit, but barring any injury, Russell Wilson's going to continue to be consistent as long as Pete Carroll and Schottenheimer are willing to put the ball in his hands for 4 quarters. That's the big change this year. We've talked about it. It's the hashtag Let Russ Cook year 2020. The big change is they're going to start putting the ball in Russell Wilson's hands from the beginning of the game instead of in the 3rd or 4th quarter when they're down. Dak Prescott, the quarterback for the Cowboys, on the other side, also had a great game last week, week 2 against the Falcons. He started a little slow. I think all of the Cowboys started a little slow. That allowed Atlanta to get that massive lead in the first quarter. But Dak ended up with, I think, 450 passing yards on the game. So it's lining up to be a great quarterback battle this week. I think Dak will be able to carve apart the Seahawks secondary, especially if the pass rush is poor again this week, like it was last week against the Patriots. I'm talking about the Seahawks pass rush. If Dak has time in the pocket, if that new young Dallas offensive line is able to give Dak the protection he needs in the pocket, Dak will have the time to find the options, find the gaps in the Seahawks secondary, and really rack up a similar amount of passing yards. I mean, we've seen both quarterbacks, Cam Newton and Matt Ryan, have plenty of passing yards in week 1 and week 2 against the Seahawks. On the other side of the ball, Russell playing the Cowboys defense. The Cowboys are missing 2, potentially 3 of their starting cornerbacks for this game, which could really create opportunities for guys like DK Metcalf or David Moore to take advantage of those backup corners. Tyler Lockett's another guy who will probably be able to take advantage of one of those backups that will play corner for the Cowboys. They're also missing linebacker, probably their best linebacker in Leighton Vander Esch. He's been great these last 2 years for the Cowboys. He's also out this game for injuries. So it's really lining up to be yet another shootout dominated by offenses. And it's going to be a fun game to watch for fantasy players. I know that Dak Prescott, Ezekiel Elliott, DK Metcalf, Russell Wilson, of course, all of those guys will probably be must starts in fantasy. And it'll be fun to watch just how many points they rack up this week with 2 injured secondaries on both sides, 2 injured defenses, I should say, in general on both sides. It'll be interesting to see how these guys use their weapons and attack each other offensively. I want to do a special mention to the Monday night game this week because we were going from one really offensively powered NFL game in week 3 to another really offensively powered NFL game. The Monday night game this week is the Chiefs and the Ravens, and you can't really get a better matchup in the NFL, or in the AFC at least, I should say, than the Chiefs and Ravens. I mean, these guys are absolutely crazy. We'll see the other 2 major MVP candidates this year in Mahomes and Lamar Jackson. Both are our MVP winners in the last 2 years, quarterbacking the Chiefs and Ravens respectively. We'll see those guys face off again. That will be a super, super fun, high-powered offenses game to watch, and I'm really excited for the Monday night game, actually. These have got to be the 2 best teams in the AFC, and it's going to go back and forth. This is going to be a really important game, a pivotal game for these 2, because I think these are going to be the 2 teams at the end of the season in the AFC that are fighting for the number 1 seed, and the number 1 seed means a lot more than the number 2 seed this year. Throughout history in the NFL, the number 1 and 2 seed, all it really meant was that if you matched up, you both get the bye in the history of the NFL, right? Until this year, in the old playoff format, both the number 1 and number 2 seeds got that bye in the wild card round. The only difference is if the number 1 and 2 seeds matched up in the NFC or AFC championship game, the number 1 seed would get that home field advantage. However, this year they changed the playoff format. They added a 7th team in each conference making the playoffs, which means the 2nd seed has to play on wild card weekend. The number 1 seed in each conference, NFC and AFC, will be the only team that gets the bye week through the wild card round. And late in the year, when your guys are banged up, having that bye week, getting another week to rest those guys, it is huge, absolutely huge. It can make a world of difference going into the divisional and championship rounds if your guys are fresher than the guys on the other side of the line. And this very game could decide who's the number 1 seed in the AFC. I would not be surprised to see either of these teams, the Chiefs or Ravens, finish 13-3. And whoever wins this game, obviously the loser will take another loss, but that'll determine the tiebreaker for who gets it at the end of the year if they end up with the same record. So we got plenty of stuff to watch out for in week 3 of the NFL, but I do want to give an update on the Mariners as they're inching closer to the end of their season. They finished up taking 2 out of 3 from the Astros, but as the math worked out, heading into the final series, a 4-game series to end the year against the Athletics, it was going to take a miracle for the Mariners to make the playoffs. They needed the Jays to lose 4 games, or they needed the Astros to lose all 4 of their remaining games. Last night, or Thursday night, I should say, the Astros beat the Rangers and the Blue Jays beat the Yankees, which means that the Mariners were officially mathematically eliminated from the playoffs in 2020. This extends the Mariners playoff drought to 19 years. It's been since that 2001 116-win season that the Mariners have made the playoffs. It is still the lengthiest active drought in North American professional sports, the Mariners. They still remain the only Major League Baseball club to never reach the World Series. But hey, I will say they are the only Major League Baseball club to never lose a World Series game, because I don't think there's ever been a sweep in the World Series. So the only team to never lose a World Series game, but never reach the World Series, of course, the reason for that. Well, we kind of grinded through all of that news. We had a little bit of a quick express episode here today at Around the Sound. We'll pick it up next week with more segments. Like I talked about, we'll have the Q&A opportunity at some point next week. We'll have more news. We'll have more analysis on the games that we'll see this weekend. I'll probably talk a little bit about the crazy Chiefs-Ravens game, because I'm sure that there will be plenty of fireworks in that Monday night game. We'll talk about the Seahawks-Cowboys game and plenty more. So make sure you keep up with me on Twitter at @ThePeytonThomas. Don't miss a beat on the podcast. Don't miss the opportunity to enter your questions for next week's Q&A on Instagram at Around the Sound Seattle. All right, thank you for listening, guys. We'll have episode 6 and 7 next week. I'll have episode 6 up on Wednesday of next week for you guys, so I will see you all there.